Welcome back to Martin's Daughter. On this episode of Necessary Conversations, I spoke with Paul Lott. Paul Lott is a brilliant intellectual and also a down-to-earth mentor. And we talked about everything from the best way to educate our kids to the miseducation of African Americans that has been happening for decades. This conversation was about 3 hours long because he was a really interesting guy, but I might have forgot to get the opening. So in this one, we're just going to jump in. So without further ado, here's Paul Lott. I was reading on your page that you grew up in the South, in the heart of racism.
Yep.
I never experienced anything like that. But what I really wanted to hit was, I've actually had young people tell me today is worse than it was in the 60s. and I don't know the stories because I wasn't around. I didn't experience it. So I would love to hear what it was like if you're open to hearing something.
Okay, so this is the funny part. Again, the stories weren't the stories. Growing up in the South, okay, so I was born in the Midwest. A lot of people don't realize that the Klan was headquartered in the Midwest, not in the South, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In the modern, earlier on, they started out in Mississippi and that. So my grandparents are from Mississippi. When I was younger, I think I wrote an article once. I was born a racist. When I was younger, I barely knew any white people. In fact, till kindergarten, I had not directly ever met a white person. So for 4 years, it was mostly relatives and people of my own race. And that would have been typical for the time because of segregation. There were always stories about what white people were doing, but I never saw white people do it. You know, there were stories of, like I did have a cousin that was killed in a suspected, the racially oriented way. Of course, no one ever sat down and said, well, the case was he was found drowned in his boat. You know, there were some white people that were displeased in the town about he was going to college and, you know, kind of mixing with people. No one ever came down and said, we killed him because this black guy should not have been at this school with white people. When you're found drowned and you're in the boat, that's kind of the conclusion that was drawn from it. So there was the part of actual things happening. And this is the way I separate them. There is racism, and then there's racial discrimination. Racism is how you feel or what you think. Racial discrimination is how you act on it. And racism doesn't necessarily come automatically, doesn't always have racial discrimination. And we can legislate racial discrimination, but we can't change racism. We can't change the way a person feels about something. Never gonna change. So growing up, sitting with relatives, overhearing them, there was always this narrative about how bad white people were. Then when I went to the kindergarten, I had a white kindergarten teacher. And that was the first white person I ever had real direct contact with. And I was stunned that she was nothing like what I was told she was. She was nice, she was loving, you know, and her name was Mrs. Randall. And, you know, and she taught me, you know, she's teaching me to learn things, and that was all good. And then I encountered, you know, there was the anti-education culture in the Black community. But it wasn't coming from white people. It was coming from Black people. Other Black children were constantly pressuring me not to do my schoolwork. A white person never told me not to do my schoolwork, ever. And I noticed that. I'm going, Now I did encounter, when I was in, we had moved back up from, we were in the Midwest, we were in Illinois. I did have a situation where a little white kid just did not like me for whatever reason. Then he pretended to like me. And then, you know, he had me take a shortcut, quote unquote, through some projects one day. And a bunch of his friends jumped out and they had concrete cinder blocks. They broke my arm. They tried to kill me. I don't think they thought they were trying to kill me. I think they thought they were just going to beat me up really bad. When you're 6, 7, and 8 years old, and there was 2 older kids there, maybe like 10 or 11. You don't really think you're going to kill someone. You think you're just going to be, you know, it's like the cartoons, fall out the window, get back up and walk. So, you know, I remember that. But at the same time, my best friend who walked me home every day, you know, I didn't go with him that day, was another white kid. And they owned a shop, and we would walk home along 10th Street. and we'd stop in and we get free, we called them pops in the Midwest. We get free soda pop, we get free pops, and then we would go on. And my experience is I lived in a world where most of the racial things I encountered was what people said. But on the other side, I encountered violence from Blacks and whites. But most of my Black relatives only took note of the white violence, not the Black violence. Like we moved when we're in Alabama, for example, we had the South Side rapist. It was a Black person who had over 100 victims between the ages of 6 and 80. And literally in Birmingham, Alabama, the 70s, during this time period, they had competing mass rapists. It was ridiculous. And no one sat to think we're being terrorized by our own, right? The crack house that was up the street. We kind of knew that's where, prostitutes were and drugs were, and we just cross the street, didn't go there, right? We knew who the pedophile was. He was the house at the end of the corner. You just went across the street and you got there. And if he calls you to his door, you just never went there. All of this stuff existed. and we just kind of knew what relatives were kind of funny to stay away from them, which houses not to go near. But everyone I knew was a racist. And most of us were racist towards things we'd never experienced. Right. And let me give you something that informed me of what we think about the civil rights movement as a narrative. Black poverty, right, coming out of the Civil War, right, after the Civil War was almost 100%. And 97% of Blacks lived in the South. Now, people say, oh, it can't be true. Yeah, it's actually true. About 3%, 1 to 3% of Blacks were middle class, but most were dirt poor. Think about this, there's 100%. So let's take the Reconstruction of 1868. Let's go 100 years. I'm gonna cover 100 years to 1968, okay? Between 1868 and 1959, almost half of Black poverty was eliminated. So we're about 45%, not quite, but this is the startling part. From 1959 to 1968, Black poverty went from 55% to 34.7%. In 9 years, it dropped about 20%. From the US Census data. You can go up right now in the government and look this up. White poverty was at 18.8% in 1959. It dropped to 10%. So it dropped 8.8%. So 8.8% of whites escaped poverty, but 20% of Blacks, more than double, escaped poverty during the same time period, right? So then my next thing was, as I tracked it out 50 years forward. So for 2018, the Black poverty rate had fallen again to about 20.7%. So another 14% it fell in the 50 years. So it fell 20% 9 years, then 14% over 50 years. What do you think happened to the white poverty rate? It went from 10% to 10.1% over those 50 years. So it was almost, but it bounced around. But it averages out that it stayed at about 10% for 50 years. So if you're born a Black child in America between 1959 and 2018, you're 3.5 times more likely to escape poverty than if you're born white in America. Ask myself the question, if I'm looking at this data, this racial narrative can't be true. America actually prefers you if you're a minority in terms of the way the system works. Now, the way I look at it is that the system works as the system works, and it's evening itself out over time, right? And so there is that's why I don't reject white privilege from an ideological basis. I reject it on a factual basis, because we have to have a way of measuring privilege. And if the ultimate measure of outcomes is economics, right?
Now, I do think that there's something to be said about someone said, if you get to go places and never have to wonder if people are looking at you because of the color of your skin, then that's privilege. But I look at that as that's no different than if somebody, somebody's attractive or not attractive. Somebody is overweight or not overweight. I mean, in terms of like wherever we go, people make judgments of us, but it doesn't really affect us. Like, who
White
cares?
people, white people are more limited in where they can go than Black people are.
They're more unlimited.
They're more limited in where they can go than Black people are.
Really? Why? Okay.
Let a white person go to South Chicago. The places where white people can't go without being in danger are vast and large. Vast parts of Los Angeles, vast parts of Chicago, vast parts of Baltimore, vast parts of Philadelphia. I can go vast parts of Atlanta, right?
Right.
Now, where can a Black person go and feel unsafe? We have to think about some podunk towns.
Well, I think there's the mental, right? There's the mental assuming that you're going to be unsafe. And when you go into a place and people treat you kindly. But I also think that having done some traveling and going to other countries, I definitely feel that it gives me a big appreciation for America, because I have definitely, especially when I look like natives where we travel, it's been an interesting experience to see that people can be quite bigoted towards their own, like the people they consider their natives.
Well, right. But follow my thought here.
Okay.
The problem with defining a privilege as non-economic is so subjective as to me, in my opinion, to be meaningless. Okay. If we want to land in reality, the only reason why we're having this conversation, the only reason why this conversation is taking place in America is because people are making economic judgment. The bottom line is America's racist, and that's why we have so many poor Blacks, right? That's why we have so many poor immigrants. That's why we have so many poor people of color. So to expand it to feelings is our cultural conditioning. That has nothing to do with reality. Feeling unsafe and being unsafe are two different things. There are more places where white people are unsafe than Blacks are unsafe.
Yeah, that makes sense, because like police officers oftentimes don't want to get the call if somebody's African American these days. They do not want that call, because who knows what's going to happen and what are they going to be accused of.
And things that look like discrimination aren't always discrimination, right? I did a speech in Roanoke, BLM, NAACP sat in the back. I finished the speech, we had questions and answers, and they attacked my arguments. And one of the ones that came up frequently, they said, well, what about the wealth gap? I said, well, where do most people get their wealth from? And they're like, they get it from their family. I said, sometimes that's the case, but that's not true. But where do their families get it from, even if they pass some wealth down? And the answer is they got it from their homes. A parent had a home, they died, they transferred it to a child. That's how wealth gets intergenerational relation, but even in your current generation, it's built by wealth. I said, what determines the value of your home? Whether or not it has good schools and safe streets. What don't Black neighborhoods have? Good schools and safe streets. Does that mean that white people are suppressing the value of the homes? Or is the fact that Black areas don't have good schools and the safety issue is Black caused?
And it's still the same today, where people are told, don't try academically, right? Because when you ask me wealth, as somebody who comes from the very, very poorest and aged out of the foster system, I see wealth like today, anybody who's trained can go and get a job for Google, and their wealth has boomed, right? So I feel like education is where people get their wealth from. And some people would say, well, they were starved of an education. But my argument there would be, there are so many grants and so many scholarships that go unused because education is white.
So let me hit you with another set of data, right? Have you heard something called the word gap?
No.
Okay, so there's a study done by one of the research name is Riesling. It started out were Riesling and Hart, the researchers, all they did was put recording devices in the homes of a group of women on welfare, and wealthier families. And all they did was record what happens. Turns out that over the course of a year, the wealthier households heard 3 times as many words as the poor households. Okay, so they gave a number that it's 3 million more words than what was happening in the poor households, and these were households with preschool children. Okay, so then they saw that the academic outcomes of the children who heard more words were better than those of the children who heard less words. That's the whole thing. Why, they say read to your kid, but no one really tells you why to read to your kid. So one of the things I used to run a company called School Boogie, which was an education and research type firm. And one of the things that we knew is your brain develops from the back to the front. What's at the back of what does it handle? It handles speech.
Okay.
So your brain, you handle speech and visual recognition, and critical thinking doesn't come till much later on.
That's why I was like, I know it's the back, because we don't fully develop until we're 25.
Well, women earlier. Women develop in the late teens. Men go to 25.
Okay.
Women are done about 16, 18 years old.
Okay.
That's why you seem more mature, because your brains are done.
Okay. Okay.
But a key piece, so it develops from front to back. It develops vocabulary forward. But the other piece that most people don't know, we think that when we learn something, we develop neurological connections and get smarter that way. That's actually not true. We're born with too many neurological connections. So a child's brain is overconnected. And during most of their education process, they're undergoing something called synaptic pruning. And in synaptic pruning, your brain is disconnecting unused connections.
Okay.
And so a child being born into a high stimulating environment keeps those neurological connections, and so they overperform in school. A child who is not stimulated earlier in life, their brains prune the connection. You don't realize it. Do you know that 1/4 of all the calories you burn every day is burned by your brain?
Wow.
And so in survival, you're born with too many connections, and then your brain is reducing its energy load by shutting down parts of it. And that's how we survive in nature. You're given too much, and you only keep the brain power that you use when you're young, because your body assumes that that's all you need.
So then, Paul, going back, jumping all the way over into Loudoun County and
Yeah.
to things like the SEL curriculum.
Yep.
It seems like that would be pruning of the brain, but into a very specific kind of a very specific way of doing so.
I think social emotional learning education is nonsense, but for a different reason.
Okay.
Social emotional learning is like assuming everyone has cancer and you give everyone chemotherapy.
Right.
Social emotional learning is responsibility of a parent.
Right.
Most children receive social emotional education at home, which is why most classrooms aren't chaotic. A small number of children, a minority of children, do not receive social emotional education at home.
Right.
And they're the ones that need it. The problem I have with social emotional learning is they take something that can be beneficial if you did it as an exceptions management. In other words, if someone didn't demonstrate social emotional learning, that you taught them social emotional learning and let the parents handle the rest. My problem is they're using social emotional learning and it's infused with an agenda.
Yes, that's what I meant in terms of like cutting off the parts that would teach critical thinking, cutting off and just saying, this is how we want you to think. This is how we want you to behave. And these are the only pieces that are important.
Right. See, I don't think we should not be focusing on critical thinking in the earlier grades.
Absolutely not.
Because a child doesn't have the mental, the physical hardware to be critical thinkers. So therefore, we shouldn't be doing that. In the earlier grades, we should make sure that they're mastering base knowledge, with mastering mathematics or mastering reading skills. They're mastering what I call conceptual
Yes.
learning, right? Critical thinking is, believe it or not, pushing critical thinking down to lower grades is a liberal ideology. Pushing critical thinking down was a way to, quote unquote, try to correct for social injustice. People, hear me out, this sounds crazy, but basically what happened is in the days where when wealthier families went to college, they attributed their after-school successes as, well, those colleges like Harvard and Yale and Stanford, they teach the kids critical thinking, and they're holding this critical thinking hostage for the elite. So they said, you know what we need to do? Let's start teaching critical thinking in high school. And it didn't take. It didn't create an environment that these high school students were coming out learning critical thinking like college students. It didn't work. And so they said, let's teach it earlier. And then it didn't work. And they said, well, let's teach it even earlier. And the experts stood up and said, if we teach it as early as possible, by the time they get to college, all Americans will be thinking like the guys at Harvard.
That's scary.
And that's what we've been doing for a generation. No one ever stopped to ask the question, maybe critical thinking is not being learned as it's not being absorbed the way that we want it to, because not all people are equal in their ability to critical think.
Right. So what do you think is the ideal? Because I believe, I totally believe in the banking system of education. When children are very young, it should just be giving them the facts, straight facts all the time, facts and love. That's what they need, at a certain age. And I know that about junior high Socratic seminars, learning how to listen to other people's points of view without interrupting them in a calm way. But then again, not everybody's at the same place. So what I'm always telling people when I go to the school boards and they're like, well, what should we do? And I'm like, I would stop treating people as a collective and start looking at the individual.
What I would do is I think we need to bring in science into education from a very pragmatic position. What would I do? Education's original purpose, and I'm a big data history buff, so hear me out. We didn't have a public education system for the first 154 years of this country's founding. We only introduced public education after we closed Ellis Island. So that was the 1920s. The only reason why we wanted public education was we had opened up our borders and taken in so many immigrants that they were settling in communities by country of origin and language. And these communities were absolutely the communities with the highest crime and the greatest poverty. So Mexicans with the Mexican, the Irish had their enclaves, the Italians had their enclaves, the Chinese had their enclaves, and separately they were all doing terrible. Public education was founded to focus on those common denominators that all Americans could share. So my first thing is to return to that. What goes into the public school should be to unite and not to divide. Our history was not created to whitewash the contributions of minorities. Our history was written in a way to highlight the commonality, the common history for all Americans. I think we need to go back to that. I think our history curricula should be what brings us together. Little nitpicking about the only thing that preserves racism today is school and government. If it were not for school and government, racism would have never been a problem, right? How do I know this? At the end of the Civil War, we had something like 20 congressmen and several senators who were Black get elected, right? And that's when what the people did. Government got involved. And that's when we had a problem. Jim Crow laws got involved. That's when we had a problem. Left to its natural consequence, Blacks had rights. If we don't need Voting Rights Act. We have the right to vote. We have these rights, and it's normal. Government passed laws to discriminate. Government passed segregational laws to discriminate. This was the government acting. The people elected Black people in the absence of government. Even under segregation, most poverty among Blacks was eliminated. From 1959 to 68, guess what? That was before the passing of the Civil Rights Acts. And Blacks' poverty decreased by 20%. That was without government, without programs, right? So I think that's the first thing you need to do in school. Teach what's in common. And I call it a core education approach. If we actually believe the neuroscience of synaptic pruning, then we need to double down and go back to the basics with the heavy emphasis on reading and literacy starting from kindergarten. And we don't talk about anything else. In my view, I can't teach SEL, I can't teach CRT, I can't teach any socially oriented racial justice curricula, but I can't get kids to read.
Right.
Right? And if you can get kids to read, then it's self-correcting. Peter Drucker did a study back in the late 60s, early 70s. And he had a curious question. Is there a test that I could give someone to predict their success in life, being defined as financial stability and family stability? So he took a group, it was high school, majority white, followed about 1,000, 1,200 students over a 10-year period, and over time administered tests and watched how they did in life. He gave them IQ tests, he gave them different types of acuity tests, aptitude tests, all kinds of tests. There was one test where the people who scored the highest enjoyed the greatest financial stability and family stability, so they were the most successful, and the ones who scored the lowest were homeless. What do you think that test was? The vocabulary test.
Okay.
Turns out that when you don't have words, you can't express yourself and you act out emotionally, right?
Wow.
3-year-old acts out because they don't have the words. As a child gets words, they talk to you. You can't understand anything without a vocabulary. I can't be a doctor without a vocabulary. Literally, being a doctor is mostly about learning vocabulary. It's the same for a construction worker, a school teacher. Unless we have the words
We can't communicate.
form thoughts. Not only can't communicate, we cannot understand our world or ourselves. See a tree. We can both look at the same tree, but unless we know the word tree, we can't talk about tree. And then, is it an oak? Is it a weeping willow? What type of tree is it? We can't go into the science of how hard the wood is. How long does it take to grow? We can't think about it. Without that vocabulary, you can't manage a forest.
Well, and that's intentional because the postmodern idea of like, there is no truth but power, and part of that is taking down words,
Right.
changing the meaning of words.
There is no tree.
Right. You're like, if you keep walking, you're gonna walk right into it. But,
like you're looking right at it, but there is no tree.
The founder of our school, I was speaking with her and she had talked about the great conversation. And that great conversation is what gives us the equal playing field. And part of that is our education. People always assume that I have some sort of a degree. I'm not. I'm an autodidact, and I had to figure everything out for myself. And how I figured it out and how I sound articulate and whatever else comes down to, I really like to read and I listen to people.
I can give you another reason. And this does not apply to you, but I'm saying in general. Yeah. Have you ever noticed why you've never had a low IQ, like serial killer?
No, but you're right. They are very intelligent.
Trauma prevents synaptic pruning because you're using more of your brain to survive. You actually come out smarter.
That would make sense, except then explain this, because like I said before, I worked with the foster community, and you have a ton of incredibly brilliant minds that are not doing well at life. So
because
they're
they
intelligent, but not,
vocabulary.
I'm sorry, what?
Vocabulary.
Comes back to, well, no, because when I talk to some of these people, you talk to some of these people and still living in a trailer.
Still
And they,
vocabulary.
okay,
Because and when I say vocabulary, you have a lot of there are highly intelligent people that in order to survive, they grapple with ideas, and that's why they become literate, because they struggle with expression and they give themselves the tool of expression. You have a lot of people that when it comes to trauma, you have an emotion associated with an event, and then at some point in time, you have the emotion, but you don't have the memory of the event. And so you kind of have a bodiless trauma that kind of floats through you, and you never get to a point where you can understand it because it's no longer associated with the causal memory.
okay,
And when you get to that level of trauma, that's something that short circuits the brain's normal functioning, right? I can go to work and have a bad day, and I can say I had a bad day at work. But what happens if I come back and I'm feeling a certain way and it's not good and I have no idea why, but it's pervasive and it's there? That has a terrible effect on people. I think that happens more often than people want to admit, that they have disconnected emotional trauma that has no memory. And that's not usually something that you can work out on your own. I think there's that. We have to look at across the line. And this is my theory based on data, but based on military data. When we look at poverty, the poverty rate at hanging around 10% for whites and Asians. Now Asians, but Asians started out higher and went down. It doesn't seem that we get much above or below that 10% mark. I look at that and I look at the data where the military did studies. I mean, the best studies in terms of how people function with mental capacity actually came from the military, because they wanted to build an army. And they came to the conclusion that 10% of the people, IQ of about 83, once you hit an IQ of about 83, it's very difficult to teach a person to be functional. And we have a hard time dealing with the fact that about 10% of humans are never going to benefit from education.
wow.
Well, it's just the way it is. This is not at 10%. They might have been able in a less, particularly when it comes to the information society, right? If we, and that's one of the reasons why we need more manufacturing. There are people that will be able to build a car or put a toaster together or build a refrigerator that will never be able to finish a book. It's not going to happen. No matter how long you put them in school, it's not going to happen. And if we look at where you'd ask the question, how did we do that? And I never answered you.
Yeah.
I'm going to answer you now.
Okay.
In this country, there was a period of time called the Great Migration.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the Civil War, about 97% of Blacks lived in the South. By the end of 1968, 47% of Blacks lived in the North and the West. Mm-hmm. Why did that happen? When we created public education, we did something else. We closed our borders. Mm-hmm. Because we wanted to have time to integrate the immigrants into the fabric of American society. So people don't realize that we didn't really have any immigration until 1972.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The trigger effect was we sent our soldiers off to the wars. About 500,000 Blacks went north. 4.2 million migrated after World War II, north and south. But it was not a natural migration. Most of the post-slavery era, Blacks still stayed on farms, and that was maintaining our poverty. When the soldiers came back from World War II, wives went home, but it triggered post-war industrial expansion, and there was not enough labor. So northern companies went to the South to hire people off of the old plantations and farms. The South even had passed laws against recruiting in the South to stop it. They all moved north to get manufacturing jobs. That 20% improvement in poverty was because of manufacturing jobs. If you look at every place in America today where Blacks are the poorest, that's where Blacks were the richest.
Wow.
In the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
Right? The Harlem Renaissance, right? West Baltimore, South Chicago. These are the places where Blacks were escaping poverty. And now it's exactly the opposite. So how did that switch? Well, in 1972, we changed our immigration policy and embraced globalism. We shipped our manufacturing jobs overseas. Now, how did that affect Black people? The average Black person that went north during the Great Migration had 6 years of education. They had 6.7 years of formal education, which means they had not quite completed the 6th grade. But guess what you can do with a 6th grade education? You can build a car.
Right.
You can work in the steel mills. You can manufacture. What happened was when manufacturing left, where did it leave? It left Gary, Indiana, South Chicago, the harbor areas of Los Angeles. It left.
And yet people still vote for the people who
do this,
who push the globalism, who don't bring their businesses back. Okay.
So this is the education conundrum. Blacks don't do poorly in school because of the schools. Blacks do poorly in schools because they've never done well in schools in these areas, period.
But that's not because of their brains.
That has to do with synaptic pruning. If I have a parent in the 1960s with a 6th grade education, I can have a child be born, right?
Right.
I'm gonna raise my child, but I'm still raising my child in a low mental stimulus environment.
Okay.
That passes it to the next child, and that child has the same thing. And then you add to it. So this cultural thing in the Black community about not focusing on school, it wasn't that we always felt that way. It was that this is a child, when a child does poorly, and at some point in time, if they're actually kind of trying, they come to a conclusion that they're not good at school. And rather than admitting that, they just say, I don't like school, or I don't want to be here, or it's not going to do something. That's a way to preserve their self-esteem by rejecting something that they're not doing well at.
Right.
What they don't know is that the reason why they're not doing well at it is because we need to change the early childhood parenting habits in these communities.
Right.
So if we really want to reform schools, the schools can't reform the schools. Parents have to. We need to put education programs together that teach parents how to give their child a higher stimulus environment preschool, so that it slows down the process of synaptic pruning and makes them better able to learn and adopt in school. That's the first thing. And we need to put it out there. We need to offer these programs where parents can come to the school, the elementary schools. They should have these programs running they should be given a brochure when they're when they get out of the delivery room.
Right.
Say, this is the way the brain works. This is what happens. And this is what you need to do with your child. And this is why. And this is where you can go to get help with this. And this is a support group for this, right?
Right.
So that we have a higher stimulating environment for these poor mothers, for their children. Because I think if most parents understood the idea of synaptic pruning and why they need to do that reading. Now, some of them can't. We have electronic devices. You can sit down with your child and have your phone read a story.
Right.
Right? There are ways to get around your own personal limitations. So that's the first thing. And the second thing that we need to do is I think that we need to emphasize literacy and related vocabulary starting in kindergarten. So we teach them how to read. So that is to be able to read the pages off the page, but we can work on vocabulary aside from reading. A child can understand a word before they can write or read a word. Okay.
Right.
So I think that we need to develop a oral vocabulary curricula.
But have you ever noticed the phenomena, like you're in an area that is predominantly African American, and a 2-year-old starts talking, and you turn around and you think you think a 7-year-old's talking, because these kids sometimes can talk. And I'm like, and I wondered, where does it go? Because as a toddler, I've just heard conversations where these kids are just like talking, like they sound like they're an adult. They're sassy, they're talking, they're doing all of this, and then all of a sudden,
But this is the part that you may not realize. That sassy talk of that toddler is the same sassy talk of the 10-year-old, and the same
right,
sassy talk of the 8-year-old. The vocabulary didn't expand, and the ideology didn't expand.
okay,
Right? That's a deception. We get a lot of people that can talk, that can use the words they know in a very convincing fashion, but that may be 500 words, and they need
right.
5,000.
Well, when you're talking about vocabulary, I'm thinking about the people who get on Twitter and they want to express how angry or frustrated they are, and all they do is throw things around and growl and scream and yell. And I'm like, you've lost all validity. You look, no matter what your color is, you look like a fool.
This is the thing, though, and this is what we have to understand when I talk. Okay, so a person can use words well, and our schools teach that, right? But these people have such limited vocabulary. They actually don't know that their argument makes no sense.
Right.
So I'll give you an example of the tree. Aspirin only exists in the bark of a willow tree. Okay, that's where aspirin came from. They take the bark, chew the bark, kill the pain, that kind of thing. Now imagine if your vocabulary is limited and someone says to you, oh, you have a toothache, you have a headache, just go chew the bark of a tree. So you walk up to an oak and you're chewing the bark of an oak tree, right? And I may have been in front of a willow tree and I said, just go chew the bark of the tree, right? You've generalized things because in your mind, a tree is a tree. And so you have a problem because you didn't realize that you were sitting in front of an oak tree. I mean, a willow tree. But you want to go to every other tree, and that's what these people do. Their vocabulary is like, I talk to people all the time, and they're talking about things to me, and my brain is going, you actually don't know what you're talking about. And the reason why you don't know what you're talking about is because you actually don't have the words to hold this conversation with me. And that's why it doesn't bother me. I just stop talking.
Yeah, I had a person the other day who said, perhaps you're not oppressed, you don't know what oppression is, but for the rest of us, it's in our DNA. And I'm like, the conversation that I just had with a social scientist literally proves that it is not in our DNA. And you just, I don't know, I feel sorry for people who believe that to such a level. So in your home, was it different? I mean, how is it that you were able to ignore, or did you ever buy into it and go, I don't have to study because we don't?
My father was a minister, and the exception to the education rule is that the pastor's kids are allowed to get good grades. So we had that. So we were Teflon in that respect. If you had good grades and you were the pastor's kid, they kind of expected it. Right. It was a weird thing. You can only be smart if you're a minister.
Yeah.
You know, they're the ones in the Black community that can go back and forth. But if you're too successful in the Black community, you're a sellout unless you're a pastor.
Right. Which is kind of creepy.
So I think that was a big part. And my parents were, my dad had gone to was graduates from college. My mom didn't, but they both emphasized education. But I think the best part, it's gonna sound crazy, best part of it is that we moved a lot. And so our peer circle, there's 8 of us, 8 kids. Our peer circle became each other. And our primary relationship remained with our parents because we never lived in any place for more than, say, 2 years or so. So that peer pressure was never a factor. When we moved into a place, we knew we were moving in a year or 2 anyway. We didn't really care what the kids thought. And now you look at that and it saved us.
Yeah.
because it was now my brother, who's also a pastor, who lives in Chicago, he wanted that kind of stability, not moving around for his kids. And gangs did get involved in their life. These peers did get involved. And this is a guy, my brother's a great dad. But there comes a point in time when peer pressure becomes significant, and it outshines the influence of the parent. And at that point in time, if the child doesn't have the character, put it this way, if your kid has the vocabulary to understand the short arguments of the bad guys, that's how you really protect them.
Mm.
Because these people are very smooth in convincing you of something that isn't. They're very smooth. In fact, the primary argument of CRT is what they use. America is systemically racist. You're not going to get it ahead because the man's not going to let it happen. So you may as well get your money now, forget school, join the gang, do the drugs, do this, do that, blah, 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 blah. The CRT argument is the number one recruiting message for gangs. Has been for a generation. And I know this factually. I used to take off time and volunteer in bad communities. I spent 2 years in Gary, Indiana, and South Chicago. I volunteered in Roxbury, up in Massachusetts at a time when cabs wouldn't even take you there.
Yeah.
And every single time, the gangbangers had the same message. America's racist. You're not going to get ahead. School's crap. Those guys who got out were sellouts. You don't want to be like them. And they normalized drug use as a normal way of life.
And that is, CRT, they are putting posters up. Now they will say it's not CRT. We would never teach CRT to kids. Whatever. Intersectionality is also taught by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's the one who invented it. So intersectionality is the exact same thing with another label on it. So,
well, no one teaches CRT. It's kind of like you can send your child to a Montessori school. They don't teach your child Montessori. They teach your child from a Montessori perspective, right? What's going on in schools is the implementation of CRT principles.
CRT by proxy.
And all intersectionality is a way of bringing a larger group of people into their misery ethic so that it's bigger. If you just use pure CRT and you keep it to Black people alone, Black people have always believed that America was racist. Go to 1950, ask someone. Go to 1940, ask someone. Go to 1970, 1980, 1990, it's nothing new. It's always been the primary ethos of particularly the urban Black community.
But how? This is why I ask how. Because can you not look at all of the celebrities that are living like kings who are peddling this just like a snake oil salesman? They're peddling this stuff while they are. Meghan Markle is one of my favorites. Okay, I'm like, don't tell me you're oppressed.
because it is the failure of post civil rights leadership in our country. And I forget. I think it's a koala bear, right? So if you go to a zoo, you'll see koala bears. They're never in cages.
Okay.
But they don't bother you. Why? Turns out that if you take a koala bear and put it in a 20 by 20 cage and then remove the cage later on, it'll never leave that area, right? What happened to Blacks, I say, imagine Blacks as being a bunch of people in jail. And then one day, someone walks over and says, opens the door and says, "You're free." And a group of people leave. And this is freedom in a world that is extremely unfamiliar, right? And due to that unfamiliarity, some people go out and they figure it out and they're incredibly successful. But then you're always going to have a group of people that are fearful that will not leave that cage. And I think a lot of Black Americans, that mental cage is Black culture.
Yeah.
Take away the cage and you take away a relationship with each other. Blacks feel blackness in their victimology,
Yeah.
right? Our skin color doesn't do it. We can't say where we live. We can't say it's by our race, but we can say it's by our shared victimology. And that's the division in Black America. Those who feel they are the victims are one group, and those who feel they aren't are a completely different group. Now, those people that don't feel like they're victims tend to go, tend to move ahead in an even fashion. Like, think about this. If Black poverty today is around 20%, that means 80% of Blacks aren't poor. So why do we always talk about Black poverty?